For all the negativity within the video game community, there's nothing quite like allowing yourself to get swept up in the excitement for a release and all of its potential. The hype train, however, is a cursed thing. Once it gets up to speed, very few things can slow it down. Because of this, if a game doesn't pass with flying colours, it might ultimately prove to crash and burn in the most damning ways. Sure, your game might have gotten decent sales numbers, but it can reflect pretty poorly on a company if none of the people who bought your game are playing it mere months or even weeks later. I'm Cy for WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 next big thing video games that disappeared overnight. Number 10. Marvel's Avengers. Off the double bill of Infinity War and Endgame, two films that are both in the top 5 highest grossing of all time, the promise of a Crystal Dynamics Marvel title was huge. An action RPG with cooperative elements that allowed friends to pick their favourite members of the Avengers and team up to fight evil, it almost felt like a can't miss situation. The characters all avoided their MCU likenesses, which in concept wasn't a bad move, but the designs themselves felt underwhelming in that cheap dollar store knockoff action figure kind of way. Despite this, and understandable concerns about the game's depth, Marvel's Avengers sales made it the second best-selling superhero game of all time. And then its PC player base suddenly infamously dropped by a whopping 96% just months after its release. Repetitive, grindy gameplay loops and a lack of content at launch were the most painful elements. It was also releasing at the start of a new console generation, but its upgrades were delayed by 6 months, which didn't ingratiate it to players either. Like the Thanos snap itself, Marvel's Avengers went from being hotly anticipated to being a title gamers moved on from in one swift move. Number 9. Artifact. Artifact's player base never really got to any particularly surprising numbers, but it did shock with how quickly those who had invested their time and money into it turned their back on the game when they realised what they had gotten themselves into. Not exactly becoming of a title that was being touted by Valve as something that would not just change the online collectible card game space, but gaming in general. It's not surprising that the game's been pointed to and laughed at as a red flag of the attempted integration of NFTs and the blockchain into the gaming industry. Designed by legendary Magic the Gathering co-creator Richard Garfield, Artifact's real issue was that it charged players $20 to download it, unlike other CCG titles which were free to play, and then asked players to sink as much money in as possible. New, better cards couldn't be won or gained by chance, but instead had to be bought off the Steam marketplace or awarded from participating in tournaments that also required additional purchases to even take part in. Even after being made free, today Artifact has a player base of less than 100 people at any given moment, and is remembered as one of Valve's most embarrassing missteps. Number 8. The Division. Ubisoft painted a hell of a picture with the pre-release excitement for Tom Clancy's The Division before its release in 2016. Imagine, if you will, a post-apocalyptic Manhattan that has become a hotbed for competing factions. Teaming with your online allies, you might come across other groups of NPCs or other players in your struggles to survive the war zone of what was once New York City. The Division's hype was palpable. According to Ubisoft, the game brought in at least 1.2 million players across its launch weekend. However, a few months later, it would see huge drops with over 90% of its players tuning out very, very fast. Not only did players find The Division to be lackluster in terms of actual gameplay, it also wasn't what they had necessarily been sold on. Instead of a revelation or a shake-up to the open world genre, The Division was really just a fairly standard feeling looter-shooter. Beyond that, others critiqued it for simply being bland and unengaging with an empty world and fairly banal designs. Thankfully, the game's sequel had a far better time, being complimented as an improvement over the original in practically every way. Whilst it never quite managed to get the same level of excitement as the first, it also didn't have the same almost instantaneous drop-off of interest either. Number 7. Valheim. What's remarkable about Valheim was just how good it was from the get-go, launching in early access in February 2021 and instantly becoming the most talked about game of the season. Iron Gate Studios, a team of 5 people, could not anticipate its 24-hour Steam peak of nearly 500,000 players. Not only was Valheim a smooth experience in both single and multiplayer, it was also an extremely exciting one. Taking classic survival game elements and applying them to a loop of preparing to overcome each different boss fight throughout the world was refreshing, giving players very clear goals of becoming a Viking warrior worthy of ascending to Valhalla. Contrary to many games on this list, there wasn't anything fundamentally wrong with Valheim or any resentment from the players. Thousands simply sampled Valheim and moved on. At the height of its popularity, Iron Gate revealed a roadmap of updates that they would eventually withdraw and had a much more realistic approach, taking their small team into consideration. In September 2021, the game had its first major update with Hearth and Home, which saw a slight uptick of interest, but still infinitesimal compared to that first viral moment. Even with the game expecting to launch for consoles in 2023, Valheim is unlikely to explode the way that it did before. Number 6. Nintendo Labo. The Wii was huge for Nintendo, its motion control spiralling both ways into great creative uses and also cheap gimmicky ones. From there, the company took another gamble with the Wii U's dual screens. It felt as though the Nintendo Switch by comparison was far more straightforward and missing Nintendo's growing desire to experiment. And then the company announced Nintendo Labo, an idea that is still hard to explain. Combining the console's controllers with cardboard to create Toy-Con, Labo is meant to be a blend of construction and video game that, whilst bold, many couldn't quite get their heads around. Early reviews for Labo were at the very least mixed, and several remarked that despite the interesting approach, there just wasn't much replayability in each game associated with the Toy-Cons. Even later releases, such as the VR kit, met the same fate, and Toy-Con integration into existing Nintendo titles was not going to convince those who had already made their mind up about the concept. Nintendo pushed hard for the Labo to be their next big innovation, but all it seemed to generate from the large majority of gamers was mild curiosity at best. The company hasn't produced a new kit for Labo since 2019, but most people stopped thinking about Ninty's cardboard kits overnight. Number 5. For Honor. In an industry long oversaturated with shooters, if a game can promote an exciting competitive multiplayer feel with a different edge, it's almost certainly going to grab plenty of attention. For Honor, Ubisoft's clash of Vikings, samurais and Roman gladiators was instantly attractive for its hard and fast-paced melee-focused combat. When the open beta launched, not only was it a hotly viewed title on Twitch, the beta itself shot straight up to the number 3 spot of the most played games on Steam. However, server issues that caused lag and kicked players from matches were the first signs of trouble that ultimately sliced For Honor's potential off at the knees. Ubisoft didn't pull back far enough to work on the game and iron out the issues that players had reported during the beta. For Honor's full release did garner 1 million sales, but it was a telling sign that it had 36% less players in this week compared to its beta, and then in the space of 3 months, most had left the game. The Division's abandonment a year prior was fresh in everyone's minds, and thus comparisons were obviously made, with For Honor even outdoing the Division's drop with 95% of players going elsewhere fast. Number 4. Rumbleverse. To take the crown from such a deeply embedded game like Fortnite, you really need to do more than just create a better version of the same formula. This is where Rumbleverse really came out of the box swinging. Whilst most Battle Royale games start with players panicking as they try to find their first weapon, Rumbleverse's characters' bodies are the weapon. With its bizarre pro-wrestling twist, the game asks players to get as close to their opponents as they can, pile driving or choke slamming them into walls, or hitting them with an elbow drop off a skyscraper. Unfortunately, relative newcomer Rumbleverse has suffered from plenty of issues in its first few weeks that almost certainly drove players away. Long queues as well as in-game latency is a double dose of frustration, which is truly a shame since the game actually has a lot going for it. The issue is many have lost their passion for Rumbleverse already thanks to a lack of stabilisation. With a live service title such as this, developers Iron Galaxy really needed to be ready to address issues as they arose when Rumbleverse went live, but weeks after release there's still problems which are clearly a deal breaker considering the game's visible decline in interest. Number 3. Evolve. The Left 4 Dead series was a real moment in online multiplayer, a fully cooperative zombie survival game that was at times as terrifying as it was addictive, and the two games really put developers Turtle Rock Studio on the map. So for their next major property, Turtle Rock flipped the script entirely. Instead of 4 players fighting off hordes of zombies, they would team together to face one all-powerful and evolving monster player. With their pedigree and such a delicious idea, Evolve became one of the most anticipated games of 2015. All the other issues aside, a lack of content is always a killer, and Evolve, for as interesting as the concept was, didn't keep player attention because it was slim pickings on things to do. With no narrative or even a linear progression of a campaign, gameplay was simply multiplayer match after multiplayer match until one got bored. What made things worse was that additional skins, human hunters and even one extra monster were behind the paywalls of various different pre-order versions. Whilst Evolve as an idea had a huge influence on asymmetrical multiplayer games and the 4v1 setup that has seen far more success since, it was ultimately destined to fall into obscurity. We salute you for your attempts, Turtle Rock. Number 2. Cyberpunk 2077. With 8 years of slow-burning hype that rose to fever pitch as the game drew closer, it seemed that Cyberpunk 2077's delays only made players thirst even harder for the stylish sci-fi dystopia. Before its launch, CD Projekt Red said that Cyberpunk's 8 million pre-orders alone had recouped production costs. However, the game's legacy is in its colossal launch failure, widely regarded as the worst release in video game history, as the game was totally unplayable on previous generation hardware and not exactly in ship-shape condition unless you had a high-end PC. Unlike other games in this list, Cyberpunk didn't necessarily vanish from the public consciousness after its release. In fact, it probably got even more coverage as every outlet within gaming and even outside of the industry took their deserved shots against it. But once the well was dry of hilarious memes and uncomfortable glitch compilations, everyone finally moved on to the next thing and left the smouldering wreckage of Cyberpunk behind. Most gamers wouldn't even be aware of what the state of Cyberpunk is currently in, and the 2 years of updates since have successfully turned it at least into a much more functional game on all systems. With the bubble burst, it's unlikely that its upcoming Netflix tie-in anime or additional content will scrape back even a fraction of the interest that it had before it imploded. Number 1. New World. You'd be forgiven for forgetting that Amazon Games is even a real studio. One of the most profitable companies in the world, it's shocking that Amazon is yet to make any real kind of impact on the gaming space, although 2021 MMORPG New World certainly got close. Set in a fictionalized version of the European conquest of the Americas, New World was a visually stunning MMO that promised far more than it could deliver. The numbers speak for themselves when it comes to hype, and the game's launch day had a startling 700,000 players. However, the strain on the server caused obnoxious queue times, exacerbated by the fact that the game was initially announced as free to play and had instead launched at $40. This meant that when Amazon Games got things working, players were already sour when they got into the meat of New World. Many were put off by the mediocre and repetitive quest lines and long grinds for endgame content. This wasn't ideal, but the game was also dealing with bugs as well as exploits that forced Amazon to pause the game's economy, which, as you can guess, is a huge deal in a living, breathing online world. With so many reasons for players to shrug their shoulders and go back to Final Fantasy XIV, it's no surprise that New World became old hat very fast. And that's the list. Let us know what you thought of this video down in the comments below, and let us know of any other video games that you can think of that were going to be huge and then were suddenly gone. Make sure you like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe and hit that notification bell. I've been Cy for WhatCulture, and have a good week.